Hello, everyone. I'm Ron Brownstein, Senior Editor at The Atlantic, and we want to welcome you to our annual Atlantic Festival. We are so glad you are here with us this morning. Over the course of the next hour, we are going to talk about addressing public safety and criminal justice reform. We'll explore how activists, law enforcement officials, policymakers, and communities can leverage 2020's cultural momentum to reimagine our criminal justice system and address racial disparities. Before we get started, we want to thank the MacArthur Foundation for their support of the Atlantic Festival and our journalism here at the Atlantic. And we want to remind all of you at home that you can participate in the conversation via the Q&A tab. Please tell us where you are from, and if you ask a question for our speakers, we can try to incorporate them into our conversation. Now, let's get started.
For a conversation about the path forward for criminal justice reform, please welcome Barbara Creel, Director, Southwest Indian Law Clinic at the University of New Mexico School of Law; Janae Nelson, Associate Director of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund; Rashad Robinson, President of Color of Change. Atlantic Senior Editor Ron Brownstein is here to lead the conversation.
Good morning, all. Thank you so much for being with us. Janae, let me start with you. Summer of 2020, there were millions of people in the street, probably the most sustained and largest protest movement we've seen in this country since the anti-war movement of the late 1960s and the civil rights movement of the mid-1960s. Here we are at the end of the summer of 2021, and we have hit a stalemate on police reform in the Senate that apparently dooms the prospect of legislative action. What was the arc? How did we get from 2020 to where we are now at the end of the summer of 2021?
Deeply encouraged by all of the leadership and the willingness for people across generations and races and affiliations to come out and recognize that we have an absolute crisis in policing. We have a crisis in public safety that must be addressed. And what we saw was everyday people putting themselves on the line, doing the work as citizens and residents of this country to bring awareness to this crisis. And we saw an absolute failure of leadership in response. Protests are not pixie dust. They can't by themselves transform legislation, transform institutions. It requires protest plus leadership. It requires protest plus political accountability. And that's where we are now. That's the arc of where we are now. We must now hold those elected officials who are unwilling to respond to the majority will of this country accountable when we go to the ballot booth. And that is going to be where we see an opportunity for the activism and the mobilization to meet up with the strength and power of the political process, hopefully to yield more durable change than what we've seen at this point.
Janae, can I narrow in? Where did you see the failure of political leadership? Where do you point to?
Oh, I point to the Senate. I point to the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act that failed in the Senate last week, despite efforts in theory on both sides, but were ultimately a stalling tactic to really deny change for millions of individuals across this country who demanded it unflinchingly of their elected officials and were absolutely disappointed and frankly dismissed by what we saw happen last week in the Senate. It passed the House twice, but it did not pass the Senate, and that is where the obstacle lies.
And we'll come back to the Senate in a minute. But Rashad, let me ask you for your sense of how we went from all of that energy, all of that mobilization in 2020 to where we are here now at the end of the summer of 2021.
Well, first of all, thank you. It's always great to be with you, Ron, and to be with my colleagues on this call. What I want to say is, similar to Janae, last summer, racial justice became a majoritarian issue. Right? The upticks in voter registration, when many people thought the best we could do in terms of activism was clap outside of windows and uplift investigative journalism, Racial justice got people into the streets. And so, the question is how do you translate a majoritarian issue into a governing majority? How do you actually make sure that the will of the people is completely heard? We oftentimes hear these things about how we are an evenly divided country, but what we actually have is real structural challenges at actually making sure that the will of the majority is actually heard. The majoritarian issues are actually become governed majorities. And so we have a whole set of things, structural barriers to actually making that possible. Filibuster, other sort of things along that line that actually really prevent us.
This is coming across okay?
You mentioned the filibuster. Can I kind of zero in there? I mean, obviously, it is the filibuster that has made it impossible to even discuss whether there is a way for Democrats to move forward without the participation of Senate Republicans. And police reform is not the only issue on which that question is looming. Voting rights significantly, immigration reform, LGBTQ rights, reproductive rights, which passed the House last week. Rashad, if all of those measures are ultimately defeated and derailed by the Senate filibuster, that will be a choice by Democrats to allow that, the Democratic majority in the Senate and the White House to allow that to happen. What are the implications for all of the groups that mobilized so much energy in 2020 if Democrats allow all of Republican filibusters in the end to block all of those priorities for different groups within the party? What do you think? What do you think? How will that play out? Do you think, Rashad?
I mean, the Democrats know what it's like to have to actually go out and ask people to vote for them. And for organizations like mine that have to go out and mobilize people, in 2022 and 2024, is it going to be our job to go out and to explain to people, hey, we know you turned out in 2020 in the midst of a global pandemic. You put yourself on the line, you put your health on the line in order to be able to vote and cast a vote. You engaged, you figured out how to vote by mail. You overcame all sort of voter suppression tactics in order to outperform the sort of the kind of polling and the numbers that were making the predictions. And now let me tell you why none of those things actually happened that you thought you were promised. It's this thing called the filibuster. And now I'm going to explain to you the filibuster. That's actually not a sales pitch to get people to turn out. And so the implications is that we are actually taking, once again, the folks who put people in office for granted. Elections are not about giving politicians jobs. They are about advancing this country and making people's lives better. And so to the extent that we are sort of in this position right now where the Democrats, I think, are making a huge miscalculation if they think that folks are going to continue to put rocks on their backs and climb uphill to sort of battle all the suppression attempts if the Democrats are not willing to do the work to undo sort of legacies of slavery and Jim Crow, rules that have actually time and time again have been used to stall progress, from anti-lynching law to other things that the country needed and the public needed. And so to the extent that this is a huge miscalculation on the Democrats' part, they actually need to deal with the filibuster. We actually can't have a conversation about why we couldn't do things when we actually could.
Thank you. Barbara, let me bring you in. I think a lot of viewers are probably not as familiar with the particular challenges Native Americans face in the criminal justice system. So let me ask you, what are the most pressing inequities and how relevant was this police reform legislation that is now stalled to those inequities that you face?
Thank you, Ron, for inviting me. And first, before I answer your question, I just want to acknowledge that wherever you are, I hope you're safe and well, but you are on native land and land that was inhabited before the colonists arrived. I'm coming to you from Albuquerque, New Mexico, the lands of the Pueblo people, specifically the Pueblo of Sandia. And so I wanted to acknowledge that this is not uninhabited land, was not uninhabited land when it was invaded. And I also want to thank my grandparents, Mawia and Xoltitaha, for all the sacrifices that they made that allowed my parents to bring me here today. So if the general public isn't knowledgeable about the issues of Native Americans, or if they have a small sliver of information, it's not because the injustice isn't there. It's because of a lack of education or a willful blindness. And so what I teach is that with natives, we have the issues of visibility. It's either hyper visibility in some very specific places, one of which is in federal court as the criminal defendant, being sentenced under the Major Crimes Act, an act that was passed in 1885 that is a racial act specifically directed at Native Americans to bring them off of lawless lands, off the reservation, and into federal courts that could face the highest penalty of the land at the time, the death penalty for any serious crimes, and subject to courts of Indian offenses. At the same time, a court that's not an Article III court, not a constitutional court. Natives lived outside the Constitution and so had no rights that we think of, that we're speaking of now as civil rights, because they were not incorporated. They weren't thought of as existing within the constitutional construct. And so all of these issues took place in the Supreme Court or in Congress outside of the Constitution. They're also subject to BIA courts of Indian offenses that punish Native Americans for speaking their own language, for performing traditional ceremonies, for infractions like plural marriages. They were like ecclesiastical courts run by an Indian agent. And for that, natives could be incarcerated, jailed, their rations taken away, subjected to hard labor. And so that's the legacy, that's the invisibility, that's how it started with the contact. But as we know, it started with violence and removal of Native people from their ancestral lands. And it's continued with the messaging today.
Can I ask you, what is the most pressing reform or change that you see needed now?
For me, it is Native Americans in federal court are subject to the federal sentencing guidelines, and they should not be in federal court at all. But when they are sentenced under the federal sentencing guidelines, they have longer sentences and harsher sentences. And there's a lack of data that exists from the Sentencing Commission itself that allows us to promote this as a reform issue. The underlying issue there is also the right to counsel. Natives do not have the right to counsel in tribal court, but those tribal court convictions will be recognized by the federal court as a prior conviction when counting the criminal history. So they've just completely missed the due process that we think of as a Sixth Amendment right to counsel across the board. And that was decided just as recently as 2016. Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote the opinion in United States versus Bryant, saying that it didn't matter that Michael Bryant didn't have an attorney in tribal court, that he could be sentenced to a longer sentence in federal court.
Let me, I know we're going to have to cede the floor soon to the next panel, but let me try to squeeze in two more quick questions. Janae, if there is not going to be legislation, how much progress can the Biden administration make through Justice Department oversight of local police departments and other perhaps regulatory maneuvers?
Well, there's a lot of power that the Department of Justice has, and we're so delighted to see it exercising that power. As we know, the Department of Justice was effectively moribund for the 4 years of the previous administration, where very few, if any, civil rights violations were aggressively investigated or prosecuted. But we've now seen the launch of investigations of a variety of jurisdictions and police departments. We are most encouraged by the audit and evaluation that the Department of Justice announced pursuant to Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, which requires any law enforcement agency, any entity, frankly, that is receiving federal funds to not engage in discrimination of a variety of sorts, but most pressingly for this conversation, racial discrimination. And so there will be an audit of law enforcement agencies. There are over 18,000 in this country, and the Department of Justice will make a determination as to whether they are engaged in racial discrimination, and they will be appropriately penalized with the withdrawal of federal funds if that finding is made. So we're very encouraged by that. But I'd be remiss if I didn't also note that without federal action, there is still work that can be done at the local and state levels. And we have been encouraged by some of the changes that we've seen that I think are a direct result of the mobilization and protests and activism that we saw last summer. We've seen a great reduction in armed officers in public schools. We've seen enhanced offerings for people who have mental health crises, and there's an alternative to armed officers coming to provide service. In various cities, we're seeing reforms of that sort, including alternatives to traffic enforcement, where there are equipment violations that should absolutely not involve an armed officer at all in terms of enforcement. So there are small ways around the edges where we're seeing some reform. But what we are calling for and have called for is a full reimagining of public safety. So we haven't gone nearly far enough. And that is where we must bring this conversation to an entirely new vision for public safety, and one that is non-discriminatory.
Let me turn to Rashad. Obviously, whatever happens at the federal level, a lot of these decisions, as we were just discussing, are going to be made at the local level. And there have been a steady flow of more progressive prosecutors elected in the last few years. On the other hand, as we have seen, there has been a significant increase in the number of murders in most major cities, even if we're still below the level in the 1990s over the past year. When you look at kind of the landscape, do you still see momentum for reform at the local level by and large, or do you think that the wave is starting to push toward backlash?
Well, there certainly is a level of backlash. And I think part of that backlash is not people that actually really want to deal with the issues of crime or violence, right? We want to have a conversation about 20,000, gun homicides, which are absolutely things we should talk about, but we don't actually have conversations about the 500,000 preventable deaths knowingly enabled by sort of corporate executives through opioids. Or we don't have the conversation about the 600,000 deaths enabled by political leaders. And the leading cause of death for Black men is heart disease, cancer, and COVID. So I think we have to recognize that when there is extreme suffering, that always produces extreme violence, and large amounts of guns always produces large amounts of violence. And so part of what our movement has to continue to do from a narrative perspective is really continue to push home the idea that if you actually care about murders in Black communities, and probably the people who are oftentimes bringing this up as a reason to put more police in our communities or to stall actual progress, then if you actually truly care about it, then you have to actually have an honest conversation about reducing the flood of suffering and trauma. And that means dealing with poverty, dealing with mental health. And you actually have to have a conversation about reducing the flood of guns. And neither one of those two things has anything to do with giving police one more dime or one more additional power or one more benefit of the doubt or one more excuse to harass and abuse Black communities without accountability. The only thing it actually moves us to is greater accountability for police, because we understand that that is actually part of producing deeper safety and justice. And in the communities where we've elected reform-minded district attorneys, and part of this work is really being led by my organization through our winningjustice.org work, we have actually seen those communities not have any more upticks in crime, any more upticks in violence than other communities. But what we've seen is a greater level of accountability on police. We've seen a greater level of interest in justice, and we've seen a greater level of interest in actually finding diversions to a criminal justice system in a country that has, 3 to 4% of the world's population and 25% world's incarcerated population. What we have here is manufactured by choices we make, and we actually have to continue to build the power to force our decision makers to make different choices.
Rashad, Janae, Barbara, thank you so much. We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you all for joining us this morning, and I really appreciate all of your insights.
Thank you, Ron.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next up, a session brought to you by our underwriter, the MacArthur Foundation, The Journey to Justice. Xavier McElrath-Bey, co-executive director, Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth, and co-founder, Incarcerated Children's Advocacy Network, with Bria Gillum, Senior Program Officer, Criminal Justice, John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and a huge thank you to the Atlantic for helping us organize this really important discussion today on race and justice. My name is Bria Gillum, Senior Program Officer at the MacArthur Foundation, and our main program or initiative for the Criminal Justice Program is the Safety and Justice Challenge. It's an initiative focused on reducing over-incarceration and eliminating racial and ethnic disparities by changing the way America thinks about and uses jails. So why the focus on jails? Well, jails, they have more than 12 million people cycling in and out annually, which is more than the population of New York City and LA combined. We also know that jails disproportionately impact people of color. Black, brown, and indigenous people are overrepresented in our local jails. And we also know that jails have become places for people who are suffering from behavioral health issues or they're unhoused. And lastly, the majority of people in jail are presumed innocent. They're there awaiting trial. So with that backdrop, the foundation has invested in over 51 local communities to help provide the resources and support for collaboration of local stakeholders to address over-incarceration and racial inequities. And it's our hope that by supporting local communities' criminal justice reform efforts, supporting research and communications activities, we can change the public perception about jails, we can have fewer people incarcerated, and we can eliminate racial and ethnic disparities across this country. So one of the individuals working on criminal justice reform is with me today. I'm delighted to have Xavier McElrath-Bey. Thank you for joining us. Xavier, I want to start by, why don't you tell us about your journey, about how you grew up in Chicago, your own experience with the criminal justice system, and how you are today leading a major organization.
Yes. Thank you, Bria, and thanks to the Atlantic and the MacArthur Foundation for inviting me in this space. And just want to say, I had a childhood that probably was very typical of many kids growing up in poor and disinvested communities across the nation. I grew up in the South Side of Chicago and back of the yards. If I were to just simply define what my child was like, it was one that contended with a lot of trauma. I grew up in a household that contended with mental health, untreated and undiagnosed mental health challenges, along with an abusive stepfather. And a lot of that rearing for me came at the hands of my parents, and then also a foster care system. And soon after, the juvenile detention center, where I was repeatedly placed. And unfortunately, by the time I was 13 years old, I had 19 arrests and 7 convictions, and was faced with a murder charge at a very young age of 13. And one of the things that I'll never forget in the courtroom there during my transfer hearing was the judge looking at me and telling me that I was incorrigible. He said I would never change. And with that narrative, I was placed in the criminal justice system. Just weeks later, I was transported to the Cook County Courthouse, where I was basically treated as the worst of the worst. My childhood, my youthfulness, my ability to change and grow and become someone new was not regarded. Much like many kids that I grew up with, were the narrative that followed us was one that we were, there was sort of presumptions of guilt and dangerousness that followed us. And sadly, just years later, they coined us as super predators. And with that came swift consequences. I was given a 25-year sentence. I was charged with something that I was deeply remorseful of, and was instantly remorseful, in fact, but that was not regarded. My mother had to see me handcuffed and walked away, and to be told that I would not be released until I was until I actually was an adult. And many of the youth that I grew up with in the system sadly were given life without parole. The narrative that they shared about me wasn't true. I did change. I became increasingly more remorseful. I changed for the better. I pursued my education, came out in 2002 with a bachelor's degree I had earned through Pell Grant opportunities that were provided back then. Been out now for 19 years. I've worked as a clinical research interviewer, as a gang intervention specialist, as a youth counselor, crisis intervener. Like I've done much of my community back in the yards and other communities across the city. And during that work, came to know that there was a movement out there that was laser focused on ending life without parole for kids. And I never forgot many of the kids that were left behind, whose lives were still there languishing while I was experiencing the benefits of opportunity and second chances. And so when I heard about the campaign, I was deeply committed, volunteered time, showed up in Washington, D.C. in 2013, went there with a desire to connect with others who were just like me. And we were tasked with creating a national network called ICANN, the Incarcerated Children's Advocacy Network. And today that network has grown to over 180 members in over 31 states. And the criteria for membership of that particular initiative of CFSY is that you have to be convicted of a homicide-related offense and/or sentenced to life without parole when you were a child. And so no one would ever want to aspire to that, but unfortunately that was our demise. And many of us, because of the reforms across the nation and really just the stalwart advocacy of families in the beginning, and then soon after, the wonderful, talented leaders who believed in our humanity, looking at the likes of Brian Stevenson, Jody Ken-Levy, and others who wanted to see a better world for kids. You know, we are now a national coalition that is equity-driven, and we focus on ending extreme sentencing across the nation through legislative reforms, and just really trying to help change the narrative and help evolve the standard of decency that recognizes all kids as having potential for positive change. And so that's my journey. I'm now co-ED at this organization, still learning. We are deeply focused on directly impacted leadership, meaning those who are impacted by the system should be in positions of power and influence to help advance this movement. And very humbly, I've been learning along the way and just really allowing myself and many others in this space, in particular directly impacted leaders, to just come together, continue to do the deep soul searching, the equity journey that we need alongside our allies and others who believe in this cause to ensure that kids who sadly are disproportionately impacted by extreme sentencing, that is Black children at a per capita rate that is 10 times that of white children, that needs to end in our country and that kids deserve better.
I mean, it's such an incredible journey that you've had. You mentioned a lot about changing the narrative and the need for that. And, you have a TED Talk, for those of you who don't know, he has a TED Talk out there called No Child Born Bad. But I want to kind of talk about that sort of in the issue area of where we're seeing such high rates of murder and such high rates of people of color being overly punished. I'm curious, sort of in your work, in your own personal journey, where do you think we should begin to sort of address the disparities that we're seeing throughout the criminal justice system? How do we change that narrative about people of color, being viewed as criminals and that they need to be in the criminal justice system?
I often liken mass incarceration as a sort of sinking ship. And for me, like my conviction in this work, and because of my experience growing up in this system, is that if this were a sinking ship, the first thing we'd do is save the children, right? And if with that understanding if children are not worthy of our mercy, then who amongst us is? Many people don't know that the United States is the only country in the world that gives children life without the possibility of parole. We are responsible for one of the most egregious children's rights violation in the world, where kids as young as 13 and 14 and 15 can be deemed as irredeemable and thrown away forever. And so I believe deeply that if we were to catalyze these reforms to bring about more recognition of our humanity, and that is of Black and Brown, Indigenous people and children in particular across this nation, and by focusing on the most egregious offenses or outcomes in these courts, we can help to ensure that the narratives have shifted. And a great part of that is sharing stories, truth telling. We do a lot of that. Our No Child Born Bad campaign was all about that, helping people understand that those who were given extreme sentences, who were deemed as irredeemable, are now out now because of the reforms, and are now helping to create and make a positive difference in their communities. And so, when I say no child's born bad, I mean in so many ways that, of course, something happened along the way that led to the most horrible mistakes of our lives. But it also speaks to the plasticity of our brains, the ability to change, recreate our lives and start anew. I see it every day in my friends, a lot of people I grew up with, and those who are part of this amazing national network. I see and recognize that those of us who were once deemed as the worst of the worst are now making some of the most greatest impacts in our communities. And that to us is undeniable. And if that's undeniable to us, then the world needs to see and recognize that. And that's why we fight every day.
Well, Xavier, unfortunately, our time is over, but really appreciate the conversation today, the inspiring words that you left us with, and the great work that you're doing with the campaign. Thank you again for joining me. And with that, I will turn it back over to the Atlantic team.
Thank you all.
For a conversation with mayors on the role of local government in public safety, please welcome Mayor Sam Liccardo, a Democrat from San Jose, California, and Mayor Tim Keller, a Democrat from Albuquerque, New Mexico. Caitlin Dickerson, a staff writer at The Atlantic, is here to lead the conversation.
Good afternoon. Hi, Mayors Liccardo and Keller. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm looking forward to this conversation, and we can jump right in. Wonderful, thank you. So today we're going to talk about a whole host of issues that you're dealing with locally, that the country is dealing with nationally, and try to learn a little bit from what you've been doing in your communities. I thought we'd start with race and policing. It's a national conversation that was reignited in the last year with the murders of both George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, that kind of re-energized longstanding calls to address issues of racial bias in policing, issues of use of force in policing. And so I'd love to hear what locally you both are doing with your police departments to try to address these issues. And I'd like to hear how perhaps longstanding efforts were impacted by those national news events. So Mayor Liccardo, let's start with you.
Well, Caitlin, I think we've all recognized that the last year and a half has dramatically changed our perceptions of policing and the issues of racial equity in our own cities. And I think San Jose, like a lot of cities, was trying to do all the right things for a lot of years. You know, we were expanding training of officers on implicit racial bias and de-escalation and doing all the things that, you know, checking the boxes of making sure everybody's wearing body-worn cameras. And we were, I think, one of the first departments to do that. We always had very diverse leadership. The last three chiefs have all been Latino. We are seemingly checking the boxes and yet completely unprepared for the really hard discussions that happened as soon as George Floyd was murdered. And I think we're hearing with different ears, at least I am, certainly, and I think many of us are, as we hear differently from the community. I think a natural response for a lot of us mayors who tend to be somewhat technocratic is, okay, I'll come in with a bunch of solutions. Here's my 9-point plan. We're going to improve accountability and police investigation of misconduct, and we're going to change our arbitration process to make sure we can get rid of bad cops. And I think what I kept hearing from the community after that was, you know, we're not that interested in technocratic solutions. We're much more interested in adaptive change and having those really hard conversations about race. And so we're backing up a little bit now, and we're having those very difficult conversations with community paneled, really focusing on reimagining policing and on reform. And hopefully, we're going to be building relationships that will enable us to make some of the concrete changes we critically need to make. We've already started on that path, but we got more work to do.
It sounds like you're realizing that this isn't going to be a quick fix and kind of stopping in your tracks and saying, let's reimagine this kind of whole cloth, which is a lot harder, as you pointed out, than putting into place some of the reforms that have been out there for a long time. On the other side of this conversation about policing is also crime prevention, of course, right? And that's something that Mayor Keller, you've worked on quite a bit. You have a 40-point checklist for addressing it. And so I'd love to hear about that checklist. I'd love to hear about, you know, what are the kinds of crimes that you're most concerned about in your city, and how do you balance it with this other conversation happening nationally?
Well, it's the balancing act is always difficult, and I think also, you know, each city is in a different place. And in Albuquerque, you know, unfortunately, we were already under a consent decree from the DOJ for inappropriate use of force. So we actually had been having this conversation for years before I came in. In fact, one of the reasons why I ran for office was to work on this. The difference here, though, is it wasn't necessarily racial. And I just mentioned that because in our town, for like we had use of force issues that ranged across a number of categories of individuals. And so the discussion was very broad here. We've been having these questions about what is policing, what is public safety now for almost 10 years. And we had not made a lot of progress up until what happened with George Floyd. And so I think you see us in many ways sort of like the inverse experience maybe is San Jose, where our situation is people are fed up. We are so tired of waiting for change. No one wants to go back and rehash what we've been rehashing for 10 years. So what we did is something I think that really is a reflection of the courage that we got from the racial justice advocates last summer. So we had been piloting alternative forms of policing. We'd been saying, let's send a social worker and an EMT out to nonviolent crimes. And we showed that we could pull thousands of calls out of our 911 system to do that. But we didn't know where to go from that. I mean, we could expand it or whatever, but it's not really reimagining policing. And what we learned through listening, but also I think we were sort of pushed forward to try something literally different, just one thing. And that's our community safety department. So we actually built a city department that sits in parallel with the police department and the fire department. And when you call 911, you get a third response out of that emergency response system that is a social worker and someone who's trained to go out there. But the connection between your question and these two is that this is meant to, in some ways, begin to reverse the over-policing of communities of color, begin to reverse the traumatization of an armed officer at your home when that's not needed. So it's really a reflection of that public health model of crime and also trying to put in the right response at the right time. But because it's institutionalized through 911, it's very real. And that also means it might not work. We're just starting it now this winter. So I think, we'll see how it goes. But we also have a shortage of police officers. So we came into this with about 25% fewer officers than we needed to just adequately police the city. So the other end of the spectrum, to your point, is we need our officers fighting violent crime because that's also on the rise, and that's what our crime initiative is about. And this pulls them out of that system so they can just respond to those calls. And so ironically, officers actually like this idea as well as folks who are interested in reimagining policing.
That's really interesting that you mentioned this idea of trying to change what happens as soon as someone calls 911. When I was in Minneapolis following George Floyd's death, it was reporting on the situation there. That was one of the main issues, was that folks would say, I can call 911 because of someone who appears to be in a mental health crisis, who appears to be overdosing. No matter what, the first responder is always the police. That's the first response in most cities. And there's a way in which an automatic escalation can follow that. It sounds like you're trying to rethink in a way that can actually free up police officers to focus on crime, which is what they're trained to focus on predominantly. And you talked a little bit about outcomes there. Mayor Liccardo, I'd also love to hear from you about outcomes. How are you measuring the outcomes of some of the efforts that you described to make sure that you're actually moving forward?
Yeah, we've been involved with some partner universities in making sure we're collecting data well and producing that data publicly to really track uses of force, for example, by race and every other demographic, so folks can see transparently what's really happening. We're trying to do much more, I think, with the investigation process involving cops who are involved in misconduct, and really trying to move investigations of the police out of the police department into an independent entity called the Independent Police Auditor's Office. And we hope that that is also going to reveal a certain amount of objectivity that will enable better tracking, certainly from the public, but also greater confidence, regardless of the outcome of the investigation, greater confidence that we're actually holding everybody to account. This business is not easy, we know, and because it involves a lot of conflicting social forces. But one thing that always seems to be a winning solution is actually opening the kimono and really helping people understand what exactly is happening inside the department. And to the extent that we can be more transparent, we're using dashboards and so forth to try to convey that information clearly. That helps the conversation move forward.
So it sounds like transparency is a real way that you're trying to, allow the public to sort of analyze the success of your efforts just as much as your administration is. And I know transparency is something that people are calling for all over the country. So that makes a lot of sense.
And part of it is also enlisting external partners. For example, we went to the University of Texas to have them study our arrest data to really help us understand, as they're running correlations and so forth, are we disproportionately stopping Black and brown residents? And how are we treating them when they are stopped? Are they being told to sit on a curb? Are they being told in those kinds of decisions, which are typically not scrutinized, can be better scrutinized, obviously, with independent parties.
So we're going to end our discussion on a different topic. This is difficult. We're covering a lot of major issue areas in the country, but I also know as mayors, you're used to having to, focus on one crisis and then immediately turn to the next. So let's make our best effort in the last few minutes that we have to talk about homelessness, addiction, and behavioral health, all of which go hand in hand, and which are problems everywhere. And I'm curious what you're doing locally, and if you've thought about how those efforts might actually be applied nationally, because they're not, communities have their unique facets to them, and yet these are issues that are on the rise everywhere that are linked, I think, in a way that we're acknowledging as a country more than we have in the past. Mayor Keller, do you want to start?
Sure. I think there's, two things that we're looking at, but I just want to acknowledge, at least I can say, this is a really tough problem. And we had it also before the pandemic, and it certainly has gotten worse. But what we're trying to do is really, to really put it in just plain language, it's an all the above approach, because I don't think there is a particular slice that really is going to make a difference in this, because you need a blend of things like affordable housing. You got to have that amount of housing stock, especially in downtown areas and so forth. But then you need supportive housing where people can, get the services where they actually live. And we rely heavily on vouchers, because unlike a lot of cities that have like super expensive real estate, we don't. We have a lot of cheap rental houses. And so we use a lot of supportive housing vouchers in existing housing stock, and then they're paired with a caseworker. That's by far most effective way. But I'll tell you, the challenge has been so big. Albuquerque's never had a 24/7 service center for homeless folks. And so we're also taking the step where we're saying that we need a clearinghouse where people can go, where they can get, a safe place to sleep and a shower and a meal, and then sort of get sorted into, okay, behavioral health, mental health, housing voucher, job training, but they need somewhere besides the street. Like we can do better than the street. And so that's why we are building, we're calling it the Gateway Center. And we just invested $14 million in the old hospital. And the key is to have the service providers in there with us, and that it's temporary. It's just meant for a couple of days to get people into like the behavioral health system. But let me end with, I think the biggest challenge that we have is actually hiring behavioral health professionals. So to the extent, we can work with our community colleges and even in the high school system, we have a massive shortage of people to do this work. And that's holding back everyone's efforts, even with the best intentions and even with resources.
Mayor Liccardo, I hate to ask you, but it's a position you've been put in before. Just in the final 30 seconds, is there something that you can add to the conversation about homelessness and mental health that you want to share?
Well, as we think about the intersection with policing, I think every mayor would love to see more mental health workers out there interacting with individuals who are having mental health episodes, rather than having the first encounter be with somebody with a gun and a badge. And we're working hard to do that. The challenge, I think, in every city is we often rely on county partners to provide mental health services, as it is in many states where the counties are the mental health providers. And it is really, really hard to hire mental health workers right now. And it is also really hard to put mental health workers in positions that are often dangerous or could be dangerous. And so, we often hear about reimagining. Well, does that mean we have mental health workers respond to domestic violence calls? Well, maybe, but we also need to be really concerned about the safety of those individuals who are going into those situations, because we know that domestic violence is an incredibly explosive and potentially violent situation for officers or anyone else. And so So these are really difficult issues to simply respond to with a simple formula. There's no question we need much more engagement with others outside of the police department to provide the first response. And we need to find what works best from best practices around the city. We've certainly been dipping our toe very heavily in that water, and we're going to keep on trying to find ways in which we can engage non-police responses, but it's not simple.
Thank you both so much for joining us at the Atlantic Festival and sharing what you're working on in your city and how it might help, across the country. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you.
To discuss sustainable community solutions, please welcome Stanley Andrisse, Executive Director from Prison Cells to PhDs, Shanghai Armstead, Executive Director of the Alternatives to Incarceration Initiative for the County of Los Angeles, and Troy F. Vaughn, CEO of Los Angeles Mission. Senior Editor Ron Brownstein is back to lead the conversation.
Hi again, everybody, and thank you both for joining me. Stanley's having some technical difficulties, part of the modern world, and we're hoping that we can get him with us along the way. But we have a lot of expertise here already, and so Troy, can I start with you?
Sure.
I think we have seen growing awareness over the past few years from advocates and practitioners alike that criminal justice reform can't be viewed solely as a matter of changes within the four walls of the legal system itself. That if you're going to reduce inequities in criminal justice outcomes, you have to look at a much broader suite of policies ranging from housing to education to mental health. Can I start by asking you your sense of how all of these different arenas fit together, particularly with the populations that you're dealing with at the mission there?
Yeah, I think the only way, first of all, let me just say thank you, Ron, and to my friend Shanghai. Glad to be sharing this panel with you and the work that we continue to do together here in Los Angeles, and to the Atlantic and the MacArthur Foundation. Thank you for hosting this wonderful event. Ron, I think the only way that we can begin to address the issues is to continue to work together as a combined voice, right? Like bringing solutions together that oftentimes impact. A lot of times when we're thinking about change, we try to look at just our criminal justice system itself, and we look at the government entities to bring that change forward. But one of the things that we're seeing here, and particularly in Los Angeles and throughout California, is the need to break down silos and to include other considerations as it relates to having a significant impact in community. So a couple of examples of that is working to really create not just housing for individuals, but a community infrastructure that allows people to self-sustain within communities themselves. We create housing solutions, but we also create economic solutions, right? Like we help individuals move from prison to viable employment, to acquiring new levels of skill sets and education, helping them to tap into the human dignity that they all have and we all are birthed with. And so our work really centers around working with multiple community stakeholders, whether that's our churches, whether that's our businesses in our business improvement districts, whether that's our criminal justice network reforms. I also oversee an organization that I co-founded and now also serve as executive director called the Los Angeles Regional Rent-A Partnership, which is a network of over 875 organizations moving to really have a significant impact on criminal justice reform here in the county of Los Angeles and throughout the state of California. And what we found is that levels of collaboration is needed to really begin to speak to the diversity that is a part of our community. Doing it from a standpoint of looking at mental health, housing, employment, education, policy change, and reform. We cannot really begin to impact the criminal justice system until we begin to eradicate some of the things that have brought us to this place in our country, and all of the collateral consequences that have come from that. And I think that's really what the work is centered around, that level of trust and level of collaboration, knowing that we need everybody at the table in order really to bring the change that we see.
Thank you. Shanghai, your program, the Alternatives to Incarceration Unit. By the way, I should mention we have at the moment an all Angelino panel. So I'm West Coast, Best Coast, dominating the Atlantic here from the Pacific. Your program, Shanghai, was the outgrowth of an extensive study that really did try to look at the big picture here and how all of the different pieces fit together. Can you give us a sense of the parameters of what you are developing and whether there's anything else at this kind of scale underway in the country that is a model for you, or are you kind of creating the mold here?
So we are creating the mold at this scale. I mean, you know, Los Angeles County is the largest county in the nation, but we do have other communities that we can look at who've done effective work on smaller scales. So we're looking to see, you know, what other people have done with the sequential intercept model. We've actually modified it a bit to really look at where are all the different places that people enter the justice system and how can we remove them from the justice system. We're looking to our community partners, we're looking to our advocate partners, we're looking to our service providers, and partnering. Just much like what Troy stated earlier, this is not anything that we could tackle on our own. We're just sort of the grounding space and the place where everything comes together. We've also done a huge shift in LA County. I don't know if you're aware, but you know, LA voters and the Board of Supervisors have decided to take 10% of our undesignated general fund, and they've set it aside to really invest in community, invest in service providers. So we're really trying to, you know, take generations and generations of harm and over incarceration and trying to go upstream and trying to invest in communities and services and really break down the silos that you talked about earlier, because we can't address just a single portion of what's needed. We have to address the thing as a whole, right? We have to look at people as individuals.
Yeah, let me follow up there. You've been operating what, a little over a year now? Is that the program started what, early 2020?
Oh, okay, exactly. This is my 1 year anniversary of our today. So the day is actually 1 year.
Happy.
And I was the first employee. So.
Yeah, happy anniversary. Let me ask you, in that year, you know, as you pointed out, kind of following up from your previous answer, what have you reached any conclusions about where your most effective, most powerful points of leverage are in terms of reducing incarceration? Where are the interventions that give you the most impact?
So I'm going to answer it in two different ways. So one of the things I would say is that LA County has been investing lots and lots and lots of money in a lot of different ways to try to address, you know, sort of the systemic problem. It was really, so one of the things that we did when I first came on, we started looking at where are all the dollars going that are sort of dealing with reentry, where are all the dollars going that are going with prevention. And there, LA County, you know, to its credit, has invested a lot of money. The challenge has been the coordination and the execution, right? So if you have 20 different programs that are trying to affect the same population, but there's no coordination and the dollars are stretched very thin, it has less and less of an impact. So one of the things we're trying to do is trying to make sure that we figure out what's the most impactful way to help. So a couple of other things that I'll say about that. What we've realized is that people need to get out and they need to be linked at the earliest possible moment. So quite often we wait until they go far down the stream where it takes a lot more resources and a lot more people to be involved to help change a person, right? So if a person, and I could just tell you, I was a sitting judge for a number of years, I would have a defendant who came into my court and they would have one case. Within a matter of 2 years, they're now HIV positive, they have a serious drug addiction, their mental health is, you know, seriously deteriorated. And now it's taking a lot more resources to try to stabilize that individual, right? So if we pull them out at the earliest possible moment, actually before they even enter the justice system, right? So we haven't fully developed all these programs. We've developed some pilots to see how these things are working. It's only been a year, but we are seeing that it's a lot cheaper and it's a lot more responsive if we do it earlier. There's a lot we're doing, just so you know. So we started with one program, we now have 5 that we're in charge of. One is really looking at standing up the Department of Youth Development, was just pulling the youth out of the justice system. We have what I talked about, Measure J, which is now CFSY, which is we've allocated $187.7 million back to community and service providers. Never been done before, and the community helped decide where the funds should go. We're also have alternative crisis response, as you know. I co-chair that with Department of Mental Health, 988, so that people will stop calling 911. 988 will be a national number starting July of next year that people can call intervention for mental health, substance use disorder, or crisis. So the police don't have to respond. And we're trying to build up teams that are non-law enforcement teams, so we'll have others respond to people in need, including those with lived experience.
Wow. Let me Troy, let me bring you back in and maybe building off that last point. Homelessness is obviously a huge contentious issue in LA, everywhere from downtown to Venice to the beach. Yeah. Let me ask you, do you feel that the city is on a trajectory to balance the all the considerations from the homeless themselves to homeowners? Is the city on track toward getting this problem on a better direction, or is the situation deteriorating?
Well, I mean, the situation continues to deteriorate at enormous and alarming rates. And I think it's probably because, we don't have agreement within our government systems within itself. And when we don't have agreement, we can't really accomplish anything. And so we have multiple pronged approaches and solutions that people are not even trying to utilize to really begin to address the issue of homelessness in our communities. And we've adopted a one-size-fits-all model. And I think that's created a bottleneck within the system. And we need to start thinking about the human being that these services are intended to help, and start creating solutions that fit the diversity of the individuals that we're all called to serve. As Shanghai was just talking about, in terms of really beginning to look at solutions that look at everything that's tailored to a person, and not to just a group of people, right? Like that we need to start tailoring services and start seeing people for who they really are. One of the things that I'm hoping is that as we continue to look at here in the city of Los Angeles, and we have a new mayor race happening next year, that individual who is selected in that office begins to really begin to look at a multi-pronged approach in terms of dealing with homelessness in our communities. Because until we do that, we'll continue to exacerbate the issues. One thing we do know is that people that are homeless oftentimes also have some kind of impact within the criminal justice system. And so we continue to perpetuate cycles of homelessness and criminal justice connectivity. And when we do that, we're not really tearing down anything, right? Like we continue to build this system up that we know just enslaves people. One of the things that we're hoping to see is multiple housing type options to stabilize individuals that begin to address. We partner with the Alternatives to Incarceration to really create a stabilization housing component with 5 other community-based organizations here at the Mission. And those individuals are able to be placed here and diverted away from the system. So if they come in contact with law enforcement, instead of going to the criminal justice system, they're actually diverted away from that. That's a promising program that we hope to scale up here in Los Angeles, because we think that the more opportunities we can have with the face of people that are interacting with individuals, it doesn't look like a punitive face, right? It looks like one that is of their own. We're doing a lot of things here at the Los Angeles Mission and through our network partner organizations in terms of creating outreach and engagement units that work in conjunction with not only the city, but the county of Los Angeles, including our metro partners, right? Because we have a lot of homeless individuals that are on our transits stations and need to have contact and move those individuals away from being victimized in those situations and connected to resources in their community.
Let me come back on another aspect of that in a minute, but we have Stanley through the magic of 20th century technology in audio. Stanley, are you here?
Yes, can you hear me?
We can.
Yes,
so Stanley, thank you for journeying to be with us. Let me, your memoir succinctly documents your journey. It's called From Prison Cells to PhD. Can you talk about the key interventions and supports that made such a transition possible, and whether those kinds of interventions are possible to replicate on a broader scale?
Sure, and thank you for working through my technical difficulties. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. So I'm Stanley Andrisse. I am in this space as a formerly incarcerated person with multiple felony convictions who was sentenced to 10 years in prison as a prior and persistent career criminal. At that time, I was being told by a prosecuting attorney that I had no hope for change, and she was actually pushing for life. The judge granted me mercy in her eyes and sentenced me to 10 years. I am now Dr. Stanley Andrisse, an endocrinologist, scientist, professor at the Mecca, Howard University College of Medicine, and also formerly at Johns Hopkins, and visiting professor at Georgetown, Imperial College of London, lots of different things that show that this prosecutor was very wrong in her projection. But, you know, to jump right into things of what you asked, I was caught up in a case with multiple different people. It was a federal indictment case, and there was a bunch of different people that got caught up with us. All three of us that were Black got sent to prison. The two white individuals never got sent. So from the very beginning, the system saw me as hopeless, but saw these other individuals that were of the same crime as I, as with hope. So, you know, the system just beats us down. You know, for people like myself, I've been told on multiple occasions that I won't amount to anything. I'm going to be in the revolving door of incarceration. I need to settle for X types of jobs. For me, I was fortunate enough to have this mentor that saw this potential in me that I hadn't seen in myself, that I was using to hustle in the streets. And he saw that I could use that as transferable skills to pursue higher education. And, you know, higher education was this transformative thing for me in that it's not only the degrees that I obtained, it's, you know, it was almost a sense of a way to deal with some of the PTSD even. It was therapeutic in a way to be in the classroom, to be striving towards a different person. And all of that wouldn't have been possible, you know, without a support system around me. So, I mean, there's, for us, so you mentioned the book From Prison Cells to PhD, which is a book I just released, From Prison Cells to PhD. It's never too late to do good. And that last part of it's never too late to do good is a big piece. I don't know how much time I have, considering that I was late, to really go into the meaning of it to me. But just in brief, it is a phrase that my father used to tell me. We're Haitian, so we spoke Creole in the house. The actual phrase is "Il ne j'aime toi tapu fait bien." But it was this thing that, you know, somehow my dad knew that even though I was doing these bad, you know, I was making these decisions that led to me go to prison. He wanted to be patient with me, and he had this belief that it's never too late to do good. It's never too late to reach your full potential. When you're ready to see that, I'll be here for you. Unfortunately, I lost my father before I had the opportunity to reconnect with him and for him to see the different changes I made in my life. But that's the view that I think we're missing in the system. The system wants to throw us away and not see the potential in people that have the skin color as me, you know, Black individuals, boys and girls. There's no sense of we want to have restorative, rehabilitative things for individuals to do.
I was going to say, Stanley, in an article about you, I read from PBS this summer, they noted that only 2% of incarcerated people have access to college classes of the sort that you did. What would it take to materially change that number? Should that be a goal, to increase that number?
Yes, and you know, my organization that I'm co-founder of, From Prison Cells to PhD, it's also the title of the book. We work on just that, and I think one of the big things, we just had a big success in reinstating Pell. So 25 years ago, during the height on the war on drugs. The Clinton crime bill did a lot of things like changing the crack cocaine, disparity and other things of tougher sentencing. The other thing that it did, it took college out of prison. Before that, people were getting master's and doctorate degrees in prison because there was a lot of schools and universities that were able to provide education. But when that was taken away, it was almost just completely wiped out. And it was in an essence, both figuratively and literally, it was like, we just want to punish you. We just want to warehouse you. We don't want you to be provided things that can make you better. Because not only does it take away college, but you can use Pell for things like certificate programs to, learn different trades. So it took all of that away. And so after 25 years, through our, advocacy of myself, our organization, and many others, Pell was reinstated this year. And now I am actually on the Department of Education negotiation committee to figure out how we do this in an equitable manner. Because I think it does have the potential to make a big difference in that that number of 2%, only 2% of people who are currently or formerly incarcerated have college experience. This will open kind of the floodgates, and that's why we're on this equitable committee. Now that we're kind of opening the floodgates, we don't want predatory institutions coming in and trying to make money off of people just and giving them poor quality, not quality education. So, we're currently looking at how to roll it out equitably. But I do believe that is a big step that will, I hope to see I hope that 2% number to look like 20%. The public is 35% of the general public, right. Around 35% have college education. So I want to see that number move closer to that. And I think, this will be a big step in that direction.
Thank you. Let me turn back to LA real quick before we wrap up. And just one statistic I saw that just was overwhelming, that there are 6,000 people with mental illness in the LA County jails, even as efforts are being made to reduce the overall jail population because of the pandemic. One county official told a county board that, quote, "It is the largest in the country, the largest in the world, the largest population of people with serious mental disorders anywhere in one place." Shanghai, how has it reached that point, and are there ways? How essential is reducing that to creating, in fact, reducing over incarceration?
So that's a very layered question, but I will answer it in a couple of different ways. The first challenge we have is that the state is not accepting people into mental hospitals. Secondly, we do not have enough mental hospital beds, and it's taking a long time to build them. I think the shift from taking everyone out of mental hospitals and then putting them back in community without the community resources and stabilization spaces for folks, it's nearly impossible to get a person to be conserved in California right now because the pendulum has swung so far the other way. And absolutely, jail is not a place for healing. That's not what jails were intended to do. And it is a huge problem. We are trying to build up the system of care here. It is taking some time to do that. Another huge challenge we have is how federal dollars are mandated. I mean, so we talked about silos a lot, but when you look at funding streams and match dollars, they all go to one little niche, thing. And that's not the way, you have to look at the person as a whole, right? All of their needs. How can we take these dollars, stretch these dollars so we can fill all of their needs, not just a singular need, because that never helps solve the problem. It's usually a series of things that need to be solved. And I just wanted to tap on two more things that the doctor shared. So the things that he identified, and something I'm very passionate about too, is really addressing the implicit bias that happens throughout our justice system and the microaggressions that take place. When he talked about how his sentence was very different than the folks that did not look like him. That's not a mistake. That has been happening for years and years and years. We cannot forget that it was really slave catchers that were our first sheriffs and police, right? So this is a system that has been built in that way. The other three things I will say that are very important that he talked about is the importance of hope and mentorship, right? That someone spoke life into him. We are not speaking life into our kids based on social economic differences, based on racial differences, based on other disenfranchisements. And so that is what we need to start with. When you said, well, how do we fix the system? We don't start when people are in jail. We start way, way down upstream before that even happens. And then when we find that people are in crisis, we provide the supports as early as possible. And the last thing I'm going to say, and I appreciate when you talk about the three people who are on your panel, we're all people with lived experience of some sort. So we talked about prison. Troy can share his own story. I was a homeless teen and a runaway, right? I was a person who never finished high school, but it was people who spoke life into me that gave me an opportunity that I graduated from UCLA. I passed the bar the first time and I became a judge. But because of that, I have a responsibility to go back and bring other people along. And that's the part that we can't forget. But thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Those are very powerful words on which to conclude. That is all the time that we have, unfortunately. Stanley, Troy, Shanghai, thank you all for being here. Stanley, thank you for persevering and through the technical problems. And thank all of you for watching. Be sure to check out our schedule for the full list of events still happening across the remainder of the festival. And thanks again for being with us this morning.
While we're on a break, we encourage you to network with other attendees and visit our expo booths. To participate, select the networking icon located on the left-hand side of the screen. Next, click Join, and you'll be randomly paired with another attendee for about 5 minutes. If you wish, you can exchange virtual information with each other and keep in contact via direct message within the platform. You can also click the Explore icon to visit our virtual expo booths. Here you can explore more resources from the Atlantic and our underwriters related to today's event. We'll see you shortly after the break.